Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Shonen Flop Gaiden, the companion series to the podcast Shonen Flop, which dives further into detail about topics relating to the series being covered in the main podcast. This time the series covered by the main podcast was Zipman, in which a Japanese kid named Kaname grows up obsessed by a superhero called Jackman. And this sort of obsession with a superhero character and wanting to emulate that character is probably something that's very familiar to a lot of kids in America too. But when you think about superheroes, what type of image comes to your mind? If you're a Westerner, you probably think of something like this, or maybe this, or maybe even this. But if you grew up in Japan, you'd probably think about stuff like this. Why do the Japanese superheroes have such a different vibe from their Western counterparts? Well, like with all things superheroes, it really comes down to the origin story. Japanese superheroes have distinct cultural roots from Western superheroes. Western superheroes, as probably most people know, come from classic comic books from the so-called golden age of comics back in the 1930s and 40s. But they didn't come from a vacuum. Superheroes were kind of an evolution in trends that were already popular in American comic books. Some of the most popular comic books out there were either science fiction books, such as the famous Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. And also dominating the sales charts were books following hard-boiled detectives like Dick Tracy. If you think about it, the advent of costume heroes is really kind of a fusion of these two genres. You have the fantastical powers and costumes and settings of sci-fi adventures of the time, but you also have the private detective-like figure fighting against gangsters and dangerous criminals with eccentric personalities, but who kind of work outside the box of normal law enforcement, either being a private detective or some sort of renegade cop. So we have vigilante heroes fighting larger-than-life criminals, using special powers or gadgets right out of sci-fi. And to say nothing of the tradition of classical heroes like Hercules and Samson, or even Robin Hood, who serve as some archetypes that would kind of get melted together in the stew of 1930s comic books with detectives and spaceships and whatnot. While Japanese superheroes would eventually take lots of influences from the American comic book superheroes, they ultimately have their roots in different traditions. In fact, manga itself isn't really a big source of the tropes that would come to define the specific Japanese flavor of superheroes as we know it today. In fact, the original Japanese superhero didn't come out of the pages of a comic book at all, but started out as a kamishibai story. The kamishibai were a mainstay in Japan in the early part of the 20th century, before they were kind of phased out by TV. The kamishibai are street storytellers who were at their most popular in the Great Depression and the early years after Japan's defeat in World War II, but they go back way further to the 8th century with Buddhist monks who would tell stories with the aid of illustrated scrolls about the history of their monastery and stuff like that. But the 20th century version of kamishibai would feature a storyteller who would have a cart, and this cart would have these illustrated boards that could be inserted into them and changed out. The kamishibai would change these out as they were telling a story to an audience on the street, almost like a live storyboard performance or something like that. And from these performances, in 1931 precisely, came Ogon Bato, or Golden Bat, the very first Japanese superhero who actually predates Superman by 7 years. So Ogon Bato is a little bit weird looking. He has a golden skull-like head. He fights with a rapier, like old-fashioned swashbuckling heroes. And he does have superpowers, though, like super strength, the power to fly, and invulnerability, although I'm not sure how invulnerable his invulnerability is. He even has a backstory. He is from the ancient civilization of Atlantis and was zapped forward in time 10,000 years to battle against threats in the 20th century, including his archenemy, Dr. Nazo, who is the head of a criminal organization trying to take over the world. Since then, Ogon Bato has appeared in manga and anime and even movies. Other heroes came out of this tradition too, but it kind of started to die off in the early 1950s because of TV. In fact, TV, when it was first introduced in Japan in 1953, was called Denki Kamishibai, or Electric Kamishibai. Some other important roots are the classical Japanese theatrical arts of kabuki, which features action scenes with heavily costumed characters fighting villains, and also bunraku, which is a traditional type of puppet theater from Osaka, which featured very elaborate puppets and puppeteers with accompaniment by musicians and chanters giving commentary on the action proceeding in the play. But outside of these storytelling traditions, the true birth of the popular Japanese superhero was Japanese film and television in the mid-20th century, and specifically the works of Japanese filmmaker and special effects guru Tsuburaya Eiji. Tsuburaya got started in the Japanese film industry super early on in 1919. He tried his hand at directing, but he found that his real calling was in special effects, and he became an early pioneer of the field in Japan, doing such things as introducing the first crane-operated camera shots in Japanese film in the 1920s. In 1939, he founded his own special effect department at Toho Studios. However, not long after that, he got involved in the Japanese military's propaganda film machine, where he produced a lot of movies that were considered to be quite technically advanced at the time. And in fact, even some of the footage that he made was repurposed by American film reel companies for footage of the Pearl Harbor bombing. But after the war, all of this involvement with propaganda films made it difficult for him to find regular work again in the Japanese film industry because of the stigma attached to the whole propaganda business. So he had to start his own freelance special effects company and worked on some movies on a freelance basis for a while until he got rehired at Toho in the 1950s, just in time to become involved with a very pivotal film production. I am talking, of course, about the 1954 film Gojira, aka Godzilla. Now, Tsuburaya, being involved as the head of the special effects on the film, was not the first time he had really thought about giant monsters. He recounted how in the 1930s, when he was working on film in Kyoto, the film King Kong debuted in Japan, and Tsuburaya says while he was watching it, he thought to himself, one day I want to make a movie about a giant monster just like King Kong. And finally, in 1954, he had that chance. But he decided to do things a little bit differently. Instead of just straight up copying the techniques that were used for King Kong, which had Ray Harryhausen's trademark stop-motion animation to bring Kong to life, Tsuburaya instead decided to create a new technique called suitmation, which instead of stop motion, they just straight up create a suit, a modeled suit out of rubber that would be extremely detailed and would have an actor inside it, portraying the actions of the monster in live action. This would be paired with highly detailed, very large miniature sets to scale with the suit, harsh lighting, and fast motion photography to give everything a lumbering sort of feel. And this is really the beginning of what is now referred to generally as Tokusatsu film. Tokusatsu literally in Japanese just means special effects. Toku is special, satsu is photography. But whenever you use the term tokusatsu, you're typically referring to sets of practical special effects in the style of Japanese productions like Godzilla, or that have their origin from Godzilla. Now, why did I go on this huge tangent about Tokusatsu and Godzilla? Well, that's because this is really the origin story of Japanese superheroes, also commonly known as Tokusatsu superheroes. While Godzilla did spawn loads and loads of different giant monster movies, these techniques weren't just limited to giant monsters stomping around fighting army dudes. No. In fact, the next piece of the puzzle would come in the 1960s when Tsuburaya Eiji began working in television. Tsuburaya worked on several different television productions as a producer and, of course, a special effects specialist, but it was in 1966 that he would find the second great success of his career in a little production called Ultraman. Now, Ultraman is about a group of individuals called the Science Patrol, who are basically kind of like cops, like science cops, but instead of criminals, they like take care of like giant monsters and aliens and stuff. And there is a officer of this corps called Hayada Shin, and he is killed by a spaceship that just crashes into him out of the blue. But the spaceship crashed into him on accident, and the alien on board is actually a nice alien, and he feels bad for the newly deceased human and fuses with his body, bringing him back to life and giving him the ability to transform into the alien's original form to become a hero known as Ultraman. And this is where the modern archetype of the Japanese superhero really was born, because this is where superheroes got Godzilla-fied in Japan. Tsuburaya applied a lot of the techniques and concepts from Godzilla to the superhero archetype to create something that's like a bit of a fusion between the two. So we have a hero who, instead of wearing a disguise or costume, has a thing called a beta capsule, which when he activates it, transforms him into Ultraman. So he's not just disguising himself, his alter ego is straight up like a different species of being. And Ultraman has all sorts of powers, but the most important of them is to grow giant size, to be able to fight giant Godzilla-style monsters and aliens at their own scale. Basically meaning you have two suitmation characters fighting each other in a miniature environment, just like the old Godzilla movies. In these elements of transforming as opposed to just disguising yourself, as well as the changes in scale from human size to giant kaiju monster size became staples of Japanese tokusatsu superheroes. Also, Ultraman's look is very different from the typical costume superheroes that came out of 30s and 40s comics. This hero look more reflects the era it was made in, being the late 60s at the very height of the space race between the Soviet Union and the United States. So the costume is very much inspired by spacesuits worn by astronauts. But also the helmet design itself looks pretty insect-like. And a lot of these designs going forward for a lot of these superheroes will have elements of both classical Japanese armor and insect exoskeletons. I encourage you to check out the previous Gaiden episode I did about Mori King, all about insect battles and Japan's relationship with insects in general, to get a better sense of why insects in general are just considered to be cooler over there. People have a more positive outlook on them. So having something be modeled after an insect head isn't something that is supposed to be scary or inhuman. It's more cool or even cute in Japan. So with Ultraman, we have the trends that superheroes transform rather than just disguise. They fight villains taken out of monster movies and alien invasion movies rather than the pulp detective and 30s adventure sci-fi inspired villains that came out of American comic book superheroes. And of course, we have a completely different basis for the aesthetics. And going forward, there would be even more branches off from the tokusatsu superhero formula established by Ultraman that would move these hero characters even further away from the direction that American comic book superheroes were to go as the decades went forward. And since Gaiden is already coming to you a bit later than usual, we're going to have to leave off there. This, of course, is not the end of the story, really only the beginning, but I hope it does give you a better idea of where the whole Japanese superhero thing came from. Maybe in the future, if we get the chance, we'll dive back in to the subject and pick up where we left off. Until then, thanks for watching/listening. As always, I have been your host, Tucker Whatley. You can find me on the Twitter at TuckerWhatley. No spaces, no punctuation. You can also see/listen to some of my past work as a reporter and as a radio DJ at my website, www.tuckerwhatley.com. Spelt exactly the same way, still no punctuation. Hope everyone out there is staying safe and all that junk. See you, Space Cowboy. Hey, I'm tacking this on the end because this really didn't fit anywhere else. I found something while I was researching this that I thought was super weird and I wanted to talk about, but there was really no good place for it, so I'm just tacking it on here at the end. So in 1960, there actually was a black and white superhero show called Messenger of Allah. And yes, when I say Allah, I mean Allah, as in the Arabic word for God. So a TV executive for one of the major Japanese networks actually converted to Islam in 1959. And so he created a television show inspired by his new Islamic faith, which featured a superhero called Messenger of Allah, in a fantasy world based off of Arabian culture and mythology, but with a lot of sci-fi elements and stuff in it too. Doesn't really fit into anything, but I just wanted to tack that on because I thought it was a really weird footnote in the history of all this stuff. Maybe there's some alternate universe out there where Japanese superheroes, instead of taking all their inspiration from Ultraman, they all became super heavy, inspired by Islam and stuff like that. Wouldn't that be weird? And of course, a special effects specialist. Oh yeah.